Let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, herald sad and trumpet be, to whose sound chaste wings obey.
But thou, shrieking harbinger, foul precurrer of the fiend, augur of the fever's end, to this troop come thou not near.
From this session interdict every fowl of tyrant wing, save the eagle, feathered king, keep the obsequy so strict.
Let the priest in surplice white, that defunctive music can, be the death-divining swan, lest the requiem lack his right.
And thou, treble-dated crow, that thy sable gender makest, with the breath thou givest and takest, mongst our mourners shalt thou go.
Here the anthem doth commence. Love and constancy is dead, Phoenix and the turtle fled in a mutual flame from hence.
So they loved as love in twain had the essence but in one. Two distincts, division none. Number there in love was slain.
Hearts remote, yet not asunder. Distance, and yet no space was seen twixt the turtle and his queen. But in them it was a wonder.
So between them love did shine, that the turtle saw his right flaming in the phoenix's sight. Either was the other's mine.
Property was thus appalled, that the self was not the same. Single nature's double name, neither two nor one was called.
Reason, in itself confounded, saw division grow together. To themselves, yet either, neither, or nether, simple were so well compounded.
That it cried, how true a twain seemeth this concordant one. Love hath reason, reason none, if what parts can so remain.
Whereupon it made this threen, to the phoenix and the dove, co-supreme and stars of love, as chorus to their tragic scene. Threnos.
Beauty, truth, and rarity, grace in all simplicity, here enclosed in cinders lie.
Death is now the phoenix's nest, and the turtle's loyal breast to eternity doth rest.
Leaving no posterity. 'Twas not their infirmity, it was married chastity.
Truth may seem, but cannot be. Beauty brag, but 'tis not she. Truth and beauty buried be.
To this urn let those repair that are either true or fair. For these dead birds sigh a prayer.
That's it.
Well, thank you very much to the actors for that superb reading. I'd also like to thank Julia Cleave and the Authorship Trust for inviting me to speak at this event today. The work you've just heard has been called not only Shakespeare's most mysterious poem, but also the most mysterious poem in English. It has no title, but has come to be known as The Phoenix and Turtle. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that it occupied an exclusive place in the inner chambers of poetry where only poets enter. John Middleton Murray called it the most perfect short poem in any language. Yet, for all the high praise it's gathered from poets, critics and other readers, there's a problem. No one's sure exactly what it's all about. Professor Bednarz, in his recent 2012 book on the poem, said, even though it constitutes for discerning readers one of Shakespeare's most brilliant works and its fictional premise is deceptively simple, there's little agreement about what it means. or as Middleton Murray also put it, the phoenix and turtle is mysterious, but crystal clear. Various birds have been summoned to attend a funeral rite for two of their number who've recently died, the phoenix and the turtle dove. There was evidently a very special bond between the pair, which is explored in some of the poem's most striking passages. A mourning song, a threnos, is sung in honour of their memory by the poet. Surely the poem's an allegory. The two birds represent two people who had a very close relationship and who've recently died, and the poet is lamenting their passing. But who could they be? This is the crucial riddle of the phoenix and turtle. Despite over 150 years of discussion and debate, no clear consensus has emerged as to who, if anyone, the poet might have intended under the guise of the two birds. As a result, recent critical commentary has urged a move away from attempts to find a historical match for the poem's subjects. Professor Bednar says it's probably time to acknowledge a dead end in the quest for recognisable prototypes for Shakespeare's idealised avian lovers. And certainly, the poem stands on its own. It speaks of human relationships in profoundly universal and archetypal terms and doesn't require a specific frame of reference to be read successfully. And yet, who were the two birds? The Phoenix and Turtle appeared in 1601 in a book of poetry entitled Love's Martyr or Rosalind's Complaint. Only 2 copies of the book are known to exist. It was dedicated to a Sir John Salisbury who'd been knighted that year. The cover poses several questions, beginning with the 2 titles. Who is Love's Martyr? Who is Rosalind? Curiously, other than here, no character called Rosalind actually appears anywhere within the pages of the book. What is her complaint? The first poem with the same title as the book is a long allegory about the phoenix and the turtle written by a Robert Chester. Other than his poetry here and in one other volume, he's left no other mark on the historical record and has never been identified. The Chester poem is said to be translated from an Italian original written by one Torquato Ciliano. In fact, there is no such work. Love's Martyr is not a translation at all. Ciliano and his supposed poem are a complete fiction. Already we begin to sense that things are not quite as they seem here and that perhaps we ought not to take this text solely at face value. After Chester's poem follows a lengthy poem on the topic of King Arthur, and then some acrostic sonnets. And then, right at the end, comes a short final section of 17 pages in which the Shakespeare poem and some others are found. The book was apparently reissued 10 years later with an alternative title page, known today by just a single surviving specimen. It was not, however, a new edition, but a copy from the original 1601 printing with the old cover removed, the dedication page to Sir John Salisbury taken out, and this completely different cover dated 1611 stitched on in its place. None of the original names or information appear on this page. Instead, we have an entirely new title with a very curious prominent misprint. It's called The Annals of Great Britain, or A Most Excellent Monument, etc., but the second N of Annals has been printed either as a U or upside down. Here's the frontispiece of the final section. It contains about a dozen poems, or poetical essays as they are called, by 4 or 5 of the leading poets and playwrights of the day. They are not identified by name on the cover, but collectively referred to as the best and chiefest of our modern writers. That's here. The best and chiefest of our modern writers. Within, they are named as William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, George Chapman and John Marston, and one ignoto or unknown. The collection is described as, and now first consecrated by them all generally. This is the only time in his career that we find Shakespeare collaborating in print with other named writers. Why did he break the habit of a lifetime in this case? It's also curious to find Johnston and Marston working together on this project. They were bitter rivals at the time in the midst of a series of plays in which they exchanged literary barbs and which came to be called the War of the Theatres. What convinced them to set aside their mutual differences and come together for this unlikely collaboration? The theme of the Chester poem, and also those of Shakespeare and the best and chiefest of our modern writers, is the love between the phoenix, the most perfect creature that ever existed, and the turtle, which is of course a turtle dove, not the reptile, who's the hero of the allegory. The phoenix is a legendary bird with gold and red plumage. It's an ancient symbol of rebirth and self-sacrifice. The turtle dove represents constancy and fidelity. This is the first time anywhere that they'd been written about together. Ovid, in the Metamorphoses, states that after 5 centuries, the phoenix builds for itself a nest in the topmost branches of a waving palm tree in Arabia, where it ends its life in a blazing fire. Then out of its own ashes, a new phoenix is reborn. Since the days of Constantine, kings and queens have been portrayed as phoenixes, as the ideal and most supreme of birds. The term was, however, also applied by poets through the ages to exemplary men and women. The gender of the phoenix was usually male, but not always. In the Robert Chester poem, the phoenix is depicted as female and the turtle dove is male. They have many convoluted adventures, then they vow their chaste eternal love and then sacrifice themselves in the flames from which a new phoenix arises. Shakespeare's poem, however, treats the topic completely differently. His phoenix and turtle encounter each other on a higher plane, the metaphysical. The two birds are one twain, a mystical union or merging of two into one, somehow combining yet retaining their own identities. And there's a third person in the poem also, the poet himself. His obvious love for the two birds can be heard in the solemn notes of the author's voice. The overt purpose of the book was to honour Sir John Salisbury, who was knighted in June 1601 for his loyalty to the Crown in opposing the Essex Rebellion of earlier that year. He had considerable estates in Wales and was also a patron of literature and a poet, though not a very good one. He had published a long series of acrostic poems based on the name of his lover, of very complicated construction, but questionable poetic value. For many years, the Shakespeare poem languished in obscurity. And then in 1865, A.B. Grosart, a Scottish clergyman and literary editor, brought out a facsimile edition of Love's Martyr with an extended introduction, and it began to attract wider critical and public notice. Grosart was the first to propose the theory that the Robert Chester poem in The Phoenix represents Queen Elizabeth, and the turtle, her favourite, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He assembled a formidable array of textual evidence to show that Chester was, at the very least, glancing at the Queen and her young favourite, and to some degree, he was surely right. Professor Bednarz notes, Grosart argued that the poem is a covert political myth written in the wake of the Earl of Essex's execution, voicing admiration for his fidelity to the Queen. The Earl is represented by the self-sacrificing turtle dove who surrenders his life for the phoenix, the symbol of Queen Elizabeth, who had ordered his execution. Chester's allegorical poem is set in an imaginary Britain, and in one passage the phoenix is even referred to as the Queen. For any contemporary reader, the association of Elizabeth with the phoenix would have been all but unavoidable. She was regularly depicted in poetry and art as a phoenix, for example here in the famous Phoenix portrait. Here is a close-up of the phoenix pendant around her neck. Here's the beautiful enamelled phoenix jewel, which belonged to Elizabeth and is now in the British Museum. On the reverse, one can see depicted the phoenix rising up out of the flames. Above it and below the crown is a curious device. This logo, as we might now call it, is made up from the letters which spell out the name Elizabeth, intermingled and superimposed, encouraging the reader to search for and trace out each of the letters. Elizabethans delighted in such ingenious word games and puzzles. Well, if Queen Elizabeth was the phoenix, the turtle could only represent one man. It had to be her favourite, the dashing, impulsive, doomed Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. A man of military action and adventure, and also of poetry, arts and the theatre, the Earl of Essex's career reached dizzying heights of success until the events of the ill-fated so-called Essex Rebellion, and all was lost. In early 1601, he was arrested, put on trial, found guilty of treason, imprisoned in the Tower of London, condemned to death and executed by decapitation. He was just 35 years old. Despite an age difference of 32 years, there seemed to be an almost magnetic bond between Essex and Elizabeth. The exact nature of their relationship has prompted much speculation. Was it romantic, or was it something else? What is certain is that his death plunged Elizabeth into inconsolable grief from which she never recovered. She died, still broken-hearted, just a little more than 2 years after his execution. For Reverend Grosart, the relationship of Essex and the Queen could easily be read into the love and devotion of the male turtle dove to the female phoenix in Chester's poem. These same identifications were then also assumed to carry over into the other poems, including Shakespeare's. And now we come to the nub of the problem. In the Chester poem, the final status of the two birds is ambiguous and shrouded in allegory. For Shakespeare, however, there is no such ambiguity. It's crystal clear. For these dead birds sigh a prayer. The two birds are very much dead. In late 1601, Essex had been executed, but Elizabeth was still very much alive. She did not die until 1603. It is inconceivable that any poet, no matter who they were, could refer to her as dead. The objection cannot be avoided. It makes Grosart's identification extremely problematic. Even Grosart himself was astounded by the implications of his own discovery and remarked, "The fact that Elizabeth was living when Love's Martyr was published fills me indeed with astonishment at the author's audacity in so publishing." Other alternative identifications of the two birds have been proposed to get around this problem, but none fulfil adequately the requirements of the relationship as described in the Shakespeare poem, let alone explain the collaboration of the poets, or the inclusion of this material with Chester's poem and the dedication to an otherwise obscure knight of the realm. And this is where the problem has remained stuck. Now, I confess, a Baconian, which means that I'm persuaded that the name of William Shakespeare was a mask behind which was the great writer, lawyer, philosopher and statesman of the Elizabethan era, Sir Francis Bacon. I happen to be thinking about Francis Bacon's state of mind in 1601 after the death of Essex, which was a very complex business to say the least. Throughout the early 1590s, Francis had dedicated himself to helping the Earl advance at court, and especially in the eyes of the Queen. Meanwhile, Essex in turn had attempted to gain a position for Francis, in particular the Attorney Generalship, but without success. This quotation of Essex demonstrates his extraordinary resolve. "The attorneyship for Francis, that I must have, and in that will I spend all my power, might, authority and amity, and with tooth and nail defend and procure the same for him against whomever." The single-minded determination with which Essex pursued this goal for Francis has puzzled historians. Why was Essex so committed to helping him? And vice versa. Why had Francis devoted himself to helping the Earl? By the late 1590s, there'd been a cooling of the relationship, and by the time of the Essex Rebellion, Francis had made it plain that he did not support the Earl's actions. After his arrest, the Queen directed that Francis himself should take a leading part in the prosecution, which he did. The Earl was found guilty and sentenced to death. These must have been very difficult times for Francis, to put it mildly. But he also suffered another loss soon after. In May of that year, 1601, his dear brother, Anthony Bacon, his consort and comfort, as he described him, had died. Anthony, who was less than 3 years older than Francis, had lived and worked with the Earl of Essex from 1595 as his closest advisor. It occurred to me that Francis must have had a very heavy heart in the latter part of 1601 after the deaths of his two dear friends, his brother Anthony and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. However, I could not recall having come across anything Francis might have written during that time in which he gave expression to any grief. And then, one day, it hit me. The Phoenix and Turtle, the mysterious Shakespeare poem published in the second half of 1601 about two people who were very close to each other and the poet, who'd recently died and who nobody's been able to identify. The idea came to me fully formed in a single instant. The Phoenix and Turtle was Francis's missing expression of grief for the deaths of Essex and Anthony. The turtle is indeed Essex, but the Phoenix is Anthony Bacon, and the poem was about their very close and unique relationship. The match seemed all but irresistible. I quickly realised, though, that this idea, compelling as it was, cut both ways. If Francis Bacon was the real author behind the Mask of William Shakespeare, then the Phoenix and Turtle had to be about Anthony and Essex. But if it was not, then neither could he be. Here then was an opportunity not only to evaluate a possible solution to the riddle of Shakespeare's most mysterious poem, but at the same time to apply a critical litmus test to the authorship question. So I set out to do so, and in my talk today, I would like to present and discuss what I found. First, to check the dates. The Essex Rebellion, his execution, the death of Anthony and the knighting of Sir John Salisbury all took place in the first half of 1601. The publication of Love's Martyr must have taken place after the knighthood was bestowed, therefore in the second half of the year. So the deaths of Anthony and Essex certainly occurred just prior to the book's publication. The next question then was, Was Anthony ever referred to during his life as a phoenix? Amongst Anthony Bacon's papers archived at Lambeth Palace is an anonymous poem. It is written in French and Italian and praises him in unusually high terms. We can be certain it's addressed to him as his name is spelled out within the poem as an acrostic. It can be seen running down the left margin with Antoine, which is the French version of Anthony, spelled out by the initial letters of the lines of the first stanza in French, and Bacone, the Italian version of Bacon, on the second stanza in Italian. And notice the opening line calls him, in the English translation, the English phoenix of celestial origin. Antony was indeed called a phoenix by a contemporary. Now, it's one thing for an unnamed French poet to link Antony with the phoenix, but what about Shakespeare? I wondered if there are any occasions in any of the plays where he might have left any clues. Antony in Cleopatra contains the line, "O Anthony, O thou Arabian bird." And by the Arabian bird is meant, of course, the phoenix. So here we have Shakespeare associating a character, Antony, with the mythical bird. Notice that the name of the play and the character are both spelt with an H, even though they refer to the historical Mark Antony without an H. Shakespeare spells his name correctly in the earlier play of Julius Caesar, so why does he spell it this way here? In fact, the name which Shakespeare uses for more male characters than any other in the plays is in fact Antony, and its variations, such as Antonio, also often spelled with an H, as in Merchant of Venice and elsewhere. Twelfth Night was written in 1601-02, immediately after the appearance of Love's Martyr. It has a minor character called Antonio, again with an H, who's a sea captain. The name of his vessel is the Phoenix. The Phoenix is also linked with an Antonio in The Tempest. Sebastian says, "Now I will believe there are unicorns, and in Arabia there is one tree, the Phoenix throne, one Phoenix at this hour reigning there." Antonio, with an H, who is Prospero's brother, replies, "I'll believe both." So, Shakespeare has left several possible clues that he associated the name Antony, spelled with an H, with the mythical bird. So now, let's take a closer look at the life of Mr. Anthony Bacon and his relationships with Francis and the Earl of Essex. Are these compatible with the poem? Only one proper biography of Anthony Bacon has been written, and it's Golden Lads by Daphne du Maurier, published in 1975. The cover illustration to the first edition is uncanny and could not illustrate our theme more perfectly. The designer has unwittingly depicted our proposed solution. Here are shown in three linked frames, or eggs if you like, the poet, the phoenix and the turtle, Francis Bacon, Anthony Bacon and the Earl of Essex. Du Maurier discovered many previously unknown facts about Anthony Bacon's life, including the location of his final resting place in St Olave's Church in London. His death is a strange business. There's no mention of his passing anywhere other than the single line item in the church registry that Du Maurier located and one brief mention in a contemporary letter. The actual location of his burial within the church is unknown. There is no stone, no grave, no memorial. There's no record of how he died or where or any notice of a funeral or a will. Who was Anthony Bacon? He was the son of Sir Nicholas Bacon, the Lord Chancellor, and Lady Anne Bacon, known as the most learned woman in England. He lived a life in the shadows, and yet he was an extremely influential figure who also moved in the higher circles. He was educated alongside Francis, first by their mother, then at Cambridge, and then at Gray's Inn, which they entered in 1576. Later that year, Francis travelled to France in the entourage of the ambassador, Sir Amyas Paulet. He returned to London in 1579 on the death of Sir Nicholas and resumed his law studies. In 1580, Antony set off for France, and he lived on the continent for the next 12 years. He spent much time at the court of Navarre of Henry IV and was on intimate terms with the great writers and poets of the day, including Montaigne, Ronsard and Du Bartas. He was also coordinator of England's spy network in Europe for Sir Francis Walsingham. Returning to London in early 1592, he moved in with Francis in his chambers at Gray's Inn. He took lodgings in Bishopsgate the following year near the Bull Theatre and was involved in putting on plays. And then in 1595 he became secretary to Essex and moved into Essex House. He was ejected from Essex House in 1600 when the Troubles began, and little is known of his life after this. After the events of the rebellion, whilst many of the Earl's closest supporters were arrested, Antony's name barely came up in the Essex treason trial. He suffered from gout, which badly affected his mobility. He described himself as living as a bird in a cage. I wonder which bird he had in mind. Francis and Antony were extremely close. We know they were collaborating on literary projects during Antony's London years and that they kept a scrivenery of good pens or professional writers and copyists. Francis dedicated his essays of 1597 to his brother, writing, "You that are next myself." After becoming his secretary and closest advisor, Antony and the Earl of Essex also had a very close and special relationship, which transcended to a certain degree their difference in social status. Antony spoke in glowing terms of the Earl. "The unspeakable comfort and joy to enjoy my lord's presence," he wrote on one occasion. But from the Earl's side, such sentiments were reciprocated. He expressed his deep admiration for and close reliance on Antony on multiple occasions. "When I say of my letters that this is only for your own eyes, I exclude all men but Mr. Antony Bacon, who in all things is to me as the hand with which I write this. Commend me to him 1,000 times." This quotation and others reinforcing the surprisingly unique closeness between Antony and Essex are from William Tosh's recent PhD thesis on Antony Bacon and male friendship in the Elizabethan era. So there were very close bonds between all three. Francis and Antony shared the perfect love of two brothers. Francis and Essex had a mutual agreement of unknown motivation to do everything possible to help each other, at least until it cooled. And between Antony and Essex there was a very deep, close bond, perhaps impossible to characterise exactly, a combination of friend, confidant, advisor, secretary and right-hand man. So, indeed, given the closeness of the three and the fact that two of them had just died, the circumstances do at least broadly parallel those of the poet, the phoenix and the turtle in the Shakespeare poem. But what about the sex of the birds? In Chester, the phoenix is female, but Shakespeare's text is scrupulously ambiguous on this point, and there is no objection to it being male, except arguably for one word, which we'll come to. So the suggestion is taking shape, but it still does not answer many questions raised by the poem. Consider this line, for example. "The turtle saw his right flaming in the phoenix sight." What right of the turtle, if that's Essex, could the poet be referring to? And in what sense could it be flaming in the phoenix or Antony's sight? Now, for Baconians, or at least some Baconians, the Orthodox history of Francis Bacon's life is not the complete story. His devoted secretary, Dr. William Rawley, a man who knew all his secrets, published the first biography in English 30 years after his death in 1626, and it begins with a very curious statement. "Francis Bacon, the glory of his age and nation, the adorner and ornament of learning, was born in York House or York Place, in the Strand, 22nd day of January, year of our Lord, 1560. Why did Rawley list two locations for his birthplace in this way? And where were these in Elizabethan times? Well, York House was the residence of the Lord Chancellor, Sir Nicholas Bacon. It ran from the Strand down to the Thames, close to what is today Charing Cross Station. Only the Watergate of the original property now remains, showing how the Thames has shifted its banks since those days. York Place was the Palace of Whitehall, the main residence of the English monarch from 1530 till it burnt to the ground in 1698. Only the banqueting house stands today of the original complex, which once covered nearly the entire Whitehall area. So York House and York Place were essentially next door to each other on the Strand. For Baconians, Rawley's listing of two birthplaces for Francis hints at the secret of his birth. According to the secret, he was born in York Place, the Palace of Whitehall, because his mother was Queen Elizabeth herself. The baby had been entrusted to the Queen's lady-in-waiting, who was Anne Bacon, to be brought up literally next door in the house of Sir Nicholas, York House, as one of his own children. Some Baconians go even further, suggesting that there is further evidence that Elizabeth had a second son several years later, and that he was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. And to be fair, they have one piece of evidence which is highly compelling, if not conclusive, if not perhaps downright irrefutable. In the Beauchamp Tower at the Tower of London, the walls are replete with an extraordinary array of graffiti carved into the stone by prisoners who were kept there awaiting their release or their execution. These have been meticulously signboarded in modern times, identifying the prisoners and their histories. One piece of graffiti, however, has no accompanying signage or other information. It may be found carved in the stone above the door at the entrance, and it reads, Robert Tidder. Here's a close-up, which I took on a visit last year. Unfortunately, I was so excited I did not get the entire inscription in the frame, but I think you can read it well enough. It reads, Robert Tidder. Tidder was one of the accepted alternative early spellings of the word Tudor, as it comes across from Welsh to English. There is no question, therefore, that the correct modern spelling of this name would be Robert Tudor. The record keepers at the Tower of London have searched their files, and they declare that there was never any man by this name imprisoned in the Tower. Who then was this Robert Tudor? He was, some Baconians suggest, none other than Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and he left the secret of his birth and hidden royal lineage carved in stone in the most secure location in England, the Tower of London. There is contemporary correspondence from the early 1560s from the Spanish ambassador reporting that Elizabeth had secretly married the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley. It is said that they contracted a morganatic marriage, one in which the consort to the monarch does not come into royal rights or prerogatives. This was before Francis was born, but after the conception. He was therefore of legitimate birth, though with a cloud. Robert Devereux, however, as her second son, had no blemish on his legitimacy. Now, if these controversial claims by Baconians are true, then it paints an entirely different picture of the concealed motivations behind these relationships and on our poem. Francis devoted his energies to assisting Essex with the goal of having him acknowledged by his mother, Queen Elizabeth, and thus to be in a position to inherit the crown when she died. Essex naturally sought to reward Francis in return to the utmost of his powers. Francis and Robert, the concealed Tudor brothers, considered this their best mutual strategy given the ambiguity over Francis's legitimacy. Once Essex had become king, Francis would then be free to pursue his dreams of literature and the renewal of all knowledge to the benefit of man's estate. To these ends, Anthony also freely devoted his life's effort. He may not have been Francis's genuine blood brother, but they were as true as ever two brothers could be. He also threw himself into the long-term plan for Essex to be acknowledged by Elizabeth. We might say that Francis and Anthony both decided, if you will forgive me, that the only way is Essex. So between them love did shine, that the turtle saw his right, flaming in the phoenix sight. Either was the other's mine. This puzzling stanza now unfolds its meaning. What was the turtle's right? It was Essex's right to the crown. He saw it flaming in the phoenix sight because Essex understood that his best hope of gaining the crown lay in partnering with Anthony and Francis. Either was the other's mine clinches the interpretation. The word mine carries a subtle double meaning here. On one level, it means a storehouse of value, as in a mine of gold or jewels. So either was the other's mine would mean that either was a source of value and riches to the other. But mine is, of course, also the first person possessive pronoun in English. Hence, that word is the voice of the poet himself breaking to the surface in the midst of the narrative. There are three persons involved in the text: the phoenix, the turtle, and the poet. In the eyes of the poet, each of the other two considers that the other one belongs to the poet in some sense. So, when Anthony looked at Essex, he saw Francis's true Tudor brother. And when Essex looked at Anthony, he saw Francis's real-life Bacon brother. So the poet could truly say, either was the other's mine. And indeed, they were. Hearts remote, yet not asunder, distance and no space was seen, twixt this turtle and his queen. But in them it were a wonder. The reference to the queen is usually read to imply and confirm that she is the phoenix, and therefore the phoenix must be female in Shakespeare's poem, which would seem to disqualify our hypothesis. But recall, the phoenix cannot be the queen in Shakespeare's poem because she is not dead. Therefore, quite simply, the queen in this line is not the same as the phoenix. Instead, the queen has been brought in as a fourth person in this covert drama. This is the only reference which might give the impression that the phoenix in the Shakespeare poem is female. So with that resolve, we are now free to suggest that they are not a male and female pair, but two men. and the love between them is the idealised Platonic form of higher friendship between men about which the poets have always written. We can compare their relationship to that of Helena and Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream, which is described in almost identical terms of two becoming one. It need not, therefore, be a romantic relationship to engender such treatment in Shakespeare's vocabulary of friendship and love. Here then is the partially open, partially concealed, four-way architecture of the persons and relationships within Shakespeare's Phoenix and Turtle according to the suggested solution and assuming the truth of these admittedly highly controversial historical secrets. Under this scheme we can see that Grosart was indeed correct, but only to the extent that he was describing the overt strategy of the text. The Phoenix and the Turtle are intended to be read by the casual reader as Elizabeth and Essex. But for the informed reader, this is merely a blind. Under the covert strategy of the Shakespeare text, the Phoenix role is reassigned to Antony, and the Phoenix and Turtle represent Antony and Essex. So let's now take a closer look at the final section of the book, headed Hereafter, in which the best and chiefest of our modern writers offer their poems on the theme of the Phoenix and Turtle. Here is the following page in the book. It contains an invocatio, or invocation, to Apollo, the god of poetry, by the Vatum Chorus, which in Latin means the chorus of inspired poets or oracular poets. This is the group of poets including Shakespeare, Ben Jonson and the others. The second stanza speaks of an unnamed honourable friend, printed in italics, to whom the chorus are gathering to pay tribute. They ask Apollo to grant them increased powers of poetic ability in order to be able to pay him due respect and to provide them with the waters of inspiration from the spring of the Muses, the Castalian spring, so they may fill a bowl to drink a toast to him. I suggest that these last couplets from the Invocatio may hold the key to the entire puzzle. Be lavish once and plenteously profuse your holy waters to our thirsty muse, that we may give around to him in a Castalian bowl crowned to the brim. As we shall see in a moment, this idea comes from Ovid and is a clear and unmistakable reference to the very first work to ever appear under the name William Shakespeare, namely the poem Venus and Adonis. But first, who is the honourable friend to whom this toast is proposed? It's generally been assumed that it's Sir John Salisbury, but notice that his name does not appear anywhere on that page. Now here's the very next page. It has two verses now specifically addressed to Sir John Salisbury, written by the same Vatum Chorus. These are his dedications, not the two stanzas on the previous Invocatio page. The honourable friend is not Salisbury. The poets are proposing a toast to someone else. Who could it be? Venus and Adonis, which appeared in 1593, is based on an incident from Ovid's Metamorphoses. It was very popular, going through many reprints. Shakespeare's name did not appear on the cover, but was inside for the first time in print, appended to the dedication, as we heard this morning. Instead, beneath the title, where the author's name would usually be found, was a Latin couplet from Ovid. It comes from his Amores, the 15th poem of Book 1. So, the very beginning of the career of Shakespeare, the launch of his brand, if you like, was marked by this Ovidian couplet. It is his literary trademark. And here's a translation of it. Let the crowd admire trash. May golden Apollo provide me with drinking bowls filled with Castalian waters. This is exactly the same idea as expressed in the last line of the Invocatio. Given that the Vatum Chorus group of writers included Shakespeare himself, we can be confident that the reference was not accidental or unintentional. They've chosen to pay tribute to their honourable friend with the very same toast with which Shakespeare launched his name and career. It is inconceivable that Shakespeare himself would offer this particular accolade to Salisbury, a third-rate poet who wrote, frankly, excruciating doggerel. But if Shakespeare was Francis Bacon, and the honourable friend was his brother and collaborator, Anthony Bacon, then the gesture of Shakespeare in the Vatum Chorus takes on a whole new significance. Could it be acknowledging that Anthony was connected in some way to the writing of Venus and Adonis? Did he and Francis collaborate on this or on other works? Anthony was certainly a poet. There are various letters from him containing references to sonnets and other verse, which he had written and enclosed, but none of these are known to have survived. There are, however, several sonnets signed by someone using the initials A.B. of praiseworthy quality, which appear as prefatory material in several anthologies of poetry in the late 1590s and whose author has otherwise never been identified. And there's another tantalising connection between Anthony Bacon and Venus and Adonis. Critics have noted that the famous description of a horse in the Shakespeare poem appears to have been copied from a passage by the French poet Du Bartas. Closer examination confirms, however, that it must in fact have come from the translation of Du Bartas' work into English by Joshua Sylvester, rather than the French original. Amongst a cluster of obviously borrowed terms, the single word scud, meaning to move along quickly in a straight line, which appears in both Venus and Adonis and the Sylvester translation in the horse passage, is sufficient to demonstrate this. It does not correspond to any specific French word in the Du Bartas original, but was a word added by the translator to make the text flow. Shakespeare, who does not otherwise use this word anywhere else, can only have obtained it by coming across it in Sylvester's translation, as two independent translators would rarely, if ever, both choose to insert the same word scud here. So, Shakespeare, it would appear, must have read Sylvester's translation of Du Bartas, but there's a massive problem here. Venus and Adonis is thought to have been written in 1592 and published in 1593, but the Sylvester translation of that portion of Du Bartas did not appear in print until 6 years later in 1598. How then could Shakespeare have had access to it? A possible clue might lie in the fact that the 1598 translation, when it was published, was dedicated to Anthony Bacon. Joshua Sylvester had a close relationship with Anthony Bacon and dedicated several other works to him also. These dedications reveal that Anthony had been actively reading and advising Sylvester on his translations since the beginning of his career. From the Baconian perspective, the timing is tantalising. Anthony arrived back from the continent to London in early 1592. It was in these months following his return, when the London theatres were closed due to the plague, that Venus and Adonis is thought to have been written. Anthony may have had early drafts of some of Sylvester's translations of Du Bartas with him when he arrived from France and showed them to Francis while he was working on the poem. Perhaps the brothers worked on it together. Whatever the precise details, there is here an entirely plausible route of transmission from Du Bartas to Sylvester, through Anthony to Francis as Shakespeare, which can account for the presence of this word scud and the others borrowed terms in Venus and Adonis. And this might also begin to suggest a possible reason why the chorus of poets might have been making reference to Venus and Adonis to toast their unnamed honourable friend. But could they really have intended this for Anthony Bacon? Do the poets not confirm this in any other way? We'll come back to this. Ben Jonson was also amongst the Vartum chorus. The following year, he was bold enough to put on the London stage a very thinly disguised portrait of the hidden author behind the Shakespeare mask. Ben Jonson's 1602 play, The Poetaster, which means a poor poet or a bad poet, is set in Augustan Rome, but it was a satire on the contemporary London theatre scene. It was the culminating play in the War of the Theatres. Jonson depicts the playwrights of the day as poets in ancient Rome, himself as the character of Horace, John Marston in the guise of Crispin, and Thomas Dekker as Demetrius Fannius. Critics are agreed on all this, but there's one poet and playwright in the play who's remained stubbornly unidentified. The character is Ovid. He's studying law, but would much rather be spending his time on poetry. In the opening scene, Ovid is depicted by Jonson in the act of composing a poem, which happens to be the English translation of the real Ovid's Amores, Book 1, Poem 15. The poem that Jonson has chosen to use out of all of Ovid's works is the very one that supplies the Castalian bowl couplet, the Shakespeare trademark. And here it is in Jonson's translation. In scene 1, it reads, "Kneel hinds to trash, me let bright Phoebus swell with cups full flowing from the muse's well." Ovid's father then visits him in that first scene. Verses, poetry, Ovid, whom I thought to see the pleader, become Ovid the playmaker? "No, sir," replies Ovid. "Yes, sir," says his father, "I hear of a tragedy of yours coming forth for the common players there called Medea." To which Ovid replies, "They wrong me, sir, and do abuse you more that blow your ears with these untrue reports. I am not known unto the open stage, nor do I traffic in their theatres." Ovid is writing for the theatre, but not openly under his own name. In the play, Ovid's invited to a party where he meets and falls in love with Julia, Augusta's daughter. Then Jonson has a scene between Ovid and Julia, which is a perfect replica of the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, down to the dialogue. Jonson is obviously satirising one of Shakespeare's most famous scenes, and would seem to be implying that the character of Ovid represents the author of the Shakespeare works. The problem for critics is that Jonson is also portraying him as a law student who's writing plays and poetry, but not under his own name. It's no wonder that Orthodox commentators have not been able to mesh this description with the Stratford man. So who is he? Jonson offers some additional clues to Ovid's identity. He writes songs and sonnets. He's described as Castalian mad, and he is a younger brother. Much later in his career, Jonson published a long series of epigrams. 2 of these concern a lawyer he calls Cheverel. In one epigram, Jonson describes how this lawyer has made complaints to the authorities about the way he's been portrayed on stage by Jonson. Jonson also writes a second epigram on the same lawyer, and this time supplies his name, only slightly concealed. In acrostic format, it reads, Fran Bacon. Fran Bacon. Connecting the dots reveals the answer. Jonson is saying that this Cheverel the lawyer was Francis Bacon, who objected to his portrayal under the character of Ovid in The Poetaster as it trod rather too close to the heels of truth. Jonson apparently knew by 1602 that Bacon was writing under the name of Shakespeare and could not resist including a concealed reference to it in his satire on the London stage. His use of the specific couplet from Ovid about the Castalian bowl filled with the water of the Muses is a kind of key phrase, linking Ovid in the play back to Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. The same key phrase that appears in the Invocation poem, in which the chorus of inspired poets pay their respects to the honourable friend. So Jonson knew exactly what he was doing when he joined in with the rest of the Vartum chorus in raising a Castalian bowl to the honourable friend. He was clearly pointing to Shakespeare and Venus and Adonis. But did he also leave any exact confirmation that the honourable friend might be Anthony Bacon? He did, but in order to see it, we might need to learn to read like an Elizabethan. There's been a major new critical impulse in the understanding of Elizabethan literature in recent years. The rediscovery in certain works of a concealed undertext consisting of lawful anagrams and acrostics. A sequence of influential studies have revealed layers of meaning intentionally woven into such texts in a coherent and consistent manner. In particular, a remarkable book by William Bellamy, Shakespeare's Verbal Art, published in 2015, describes and discusses these techniques in great detail and documents their presence both in Greco-Roman literature and amongst the Elizabethans. He introduces the concept of anagrammatismos, or the art of rewriting, which he defines as the concealed reiteration of any textual entity in terms of another. These techniques were pre-Homeric in origin. They were pervasive in ancient formal literature and did not become obsolete until the Enlightenment. Bellamy demonstrates how the system works with a wealth of examples from Latin poets, and he formulates the precise rules or guidelines under which these textual strategies were deployed. The aim is to enfold a target name or word into a passage of text or a phrase, using the initial letter or letters, or final letter or letters, of words or of lines. The passage which is used for concealment should ideally have some meaningful relationship with the target name or word. A prominent position is preferable. Ideally, the target name and phrase are bounded by the same letters. One is encouraged to read with a fluid eye, up or down, or from right to left, or as well as left to right. Rearrangement, duplications, and variant spellings are all permitted. Bellamy then goes on to show that precisely these same formalisms were known and adopted by Elizabethan writers, and that they employed them to enfold additional layers of concealed meaning into their texts, including Shakespeare. According to Bellamy, conventionally subtextual anagrammatism is not only pervasive in Shakespeare's verse, but is fundamental to his verbal art. Now here is one simple example. It appears on page 3 of The Tempest at the very beginning of the first folio. Benito, which can be read as an acrostic in the left-hand margin, is a legitimate word from medieval Latin with the specific meaning of both condemned and exiled. This applies precisely to what is happening to Prospero at this moment in the text, where he's been condemned and banished from Milan. Shakespeare even makes explicit reference to these modes of reading in The Rape of Lucretia, where he writes, "But she that never coped with stranger eyes could pick no meaning from their parling looks, nor read the subtle shining secrecies writ in the glassy margins of such books." He even sends up these techniques in Twelfth Night with the scene with Malvolio and the letter which he attempts to decode from the prominent initial letters M-A-I-O. Now, Bellamy's follow-up paper to the book happens to examine the use of these strategies by Ben Jonson, specifically in the context of his contributions to the Phoenix and Turtle. He discusses the first of Ben Jonson's poems in the Hereafter section, called Preludium, at length. And he shows that, incredibly, the names of all 5 poets named as the best and chiefest of our modern writers are woven one by one into the successive stanzas of this poem according to the rules. The name of Shakespeare appears in the final stanza, woven as usual into a significant phrase. Notice the first and last letters of the phrase and the name are the same. So there's an S and there's an E. So there's Shakespeare. It uses the first and last letter or letters of the words of the phrase. There's some rearrangement and it doesn't use all the words, but that's acceptable. The resulting anagram is a perfect Shakespeare. The phrase has been constructed around the name. This really is very remarkable, and in combination with the other examples that Bellamy points out, is all far beyond any possibility of randomness or chance. But what is perhaps even more remarkable is the relevant phrase under which the name Shakespeare has been concealed. Some painted mask, his absence in our verse is all we ask. Should we have that a second time? Some painted mask, his absence in our verse is all we ask. Bellamy goes on to demonstrate that the name of Eliza, for Elizabeth, may also be found repeatedly woven into these Jonson poem texts in passages which reference the Phoenix. For example, here is a short poem by Ben Jonson which appears on the final page of the Hereafter section. It's called The Phoenix Analysed. And just to read the beginning. "Now, after all, let no man receive it for a fable, if a bird so amiable do turn into a woman." The bird so amiable, which can turn into a woman, is a reference to the Phoenix as Elizabeth. And there, embedded into that very phrase, according to the guidelines, can be found the string E-L-I-S-A, Elisa. Now, what Bellamy does not point out or notice is that by these very same guidelines, the name Antony positively leaps off the page from this very same poem. We take the first letters of the first and last words in the title, the prominent O-N beginning the title, and the prominent capital I underneath, and we read from right to left and downwards, A-N-T-H-O-N-I, Antony. Now, on first encounter, this might understandably seem like a coincidence, but there are further examples to follow which eliminate this possibility. There are 14 large initial capital letters which begin the poems in the Hereafter section. 4 of these are the letter N. Each of these has the Antony name prominently and lawfully woven around the letter, and there's one more on a capital T for a total of 5. Each one also uses the title or a name above the poem to either begin or end the Antony poem, the Antony name. So this one is the first. Here's the second one. The reading gesture in this case goes from left to right and upwards. It takes in all the letters. We start with a prominent A-N-T-H, O-N, and the I is in John Marston at the top. Here is the third one. Again, the reading gesture is from left to right and upwards. A-N-T-T-H-O-N-I-E, Antony. The fourth one is shown on the left-hand page, and you might remember this is the page with the Sir John Salisbury dedications. In this case, the A-N-T-H we notice are down here at the bottom left of this text block. The N-O is at the top right, and again we use the I for Sir John Salisbury. A-N-T-H-O-N-I. But we also have one on the other page. Again, the left corner of the block gives us the A-N-T-H. The bottom corner of the block gives an O-N, and it's attributed to a poet called Ignoto with an I. So we get A-N-T-H-O-N-I. So we have this symmetric gesture of reading which gives Antony on both sides. So that's a total of 5 out of 14 of the large initial letters, including all 4 of the N's, which have the embedded Antony acrostic. There is no question that these are intentional, in my view. Such textual games are perhaps foreign to the way we read today, but as Bellamy notes, perhaps our most difficult challenge as 21st century readers may reside in our own inherited mindset and in the alien prospect of an inherently duplicitous text. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. Here's the lower half of page 1 of that Johnson poem, Preludium, which contains the Shakespeare anagram down the bottom. But notice, just a few stanzas above, shining out from the margin, may be read out directly, A-N-T-O-N-I, Antony. Again, if the Elizas and Shakespeares and other names are present in this text, as Bellamy suggests, how much more these prominent Antonys? These techniques are not to be confused with ciphers or codes. Rather, they comprise an integral aspect of the way text was composed, read and understood in earlier times, when there was still a kind of almost magical fascination with the appearance of type on the page and its possibilities and permutations. Subtle layers of meaning can be concealed by the poet within the works using these methods. This quotation from Bellamy sums up the situation eloquently. The poem becomes a notional palimpsest, in which metapoetic entities in the anagrammatic undertext are capable of being read in counterpoint to and in conjunction with the overt dimension. With this technique then demonstrated in these techniques, let's have another look at the hereafter title page. Consider again this innocuous sounding line, and now first consecrated by them all generally. This line conceals hidden names. We take the initial letter or letters of each word and the last letter of the last word. We can rearrange the letters to read Anthony Bacon with an F left over for F Bacon. All of the words are used. The first letter and last letters of Anthony frame the line as the first and last letters. There is no possibility that this is accidental. This is intentional weaving of the name of Anthony Bacon into this title page text, concealed under what reads as a bland line without any meaningful content. If we now turn to the first line of the next block of text above this section, we find that the initial letters of the phrase best and chiefest of yield B-A-C-O in order. The initial N of names immediately below allows the eye to readily complete the target word, B-A-C-O-N, Bacon, Anthony Bacon. There are many, many more woven into almost every page of this slim section. There can be no doubt the text has been carefully arranged to produce this effect. Antony was a diplomat, an intelligencer, and a poet who spent his professional and private life immersed in the art of concealing text within text. It would be entirely fitting, therefore, that his friends would choose to honour his memory in this way. Now that we have our bearings with these techniques, let's return to the question of the identity of the honourable friend in the Invocatio verses. My first inkling of this strategy in this text came late one night, when staring at the Invocatio, the name Anthony literally leapt off the page, precisely where the phrase honourable friend occurs. Once I had seen it, I couldn't unsee it, and I wonder if you too can see the Anthony. Well, perhaps there was more. My eye was drawn to the prominent A-N and T-H at the lower left corner of the stanza. Was the rest of the name present? Were letters O, N and Y available nearby on any valid reading? Immediately I saw there were indeed 3 prominent capital letters in direct proximity, O-N-Y, A-N, T-H, O-N-Y, Anthony. Just 2 more capital letters remain within that tight cluster of text. Here they are in blue, a B and a C. Reading off the letters next to these first gives B-E, and then from right to left, C-A-N, B-Can. Over here are 2 more capital letters, an M and an R. Well, they give us Mr. So we have Mr. Anthony Beacon, using all capital letters beneath another Anthony woven into the very words, an honourable friend. The honourable friend is hereby unambiguously identified as Mr. Anthony Bacon. Admittedly, these suggestions are not necessarily easy for contemporary readers to assimilate, but as Bellamy puts it, when one's cognitive bias against the presence of concealed anagram in an inherently duplicitous text has been overcome, it becomes possible to read the covert dimension of pre-Enlightenment text with relative ease, confidence and pleasure. Whilst the 10 double pages of the Hereafter section reveal the name Anthony Bacon woven on nearly every page, it actually seems to be completely absent from the Shakespeare poem, the exception which perhaps proves the rule. On the third and final page of the Shakespeare poem, however, the text is framed by an initial capital F in the first line and an initial capital B in the first line. The last line also has capital letters "for these dead birds." So we have the initials FB for Francis Bacon marking the outer bounds of the text. And notice also that title, Threnos, which is a variation on the word threnody, meaning a funeral song. Threnos readily suggests the three of us, or we three, another nod to the concealed strategy of the text. Let's return now again to the play Antony and Cleopatra and its first appearance in print in the first folio of 1623. Notice the play begins with a large initial N. Incredibly, the N pattern is continued here. The capital letters which surround the large ornamental N provide an A, O, T, H and N. The first word nay supplies the final Y, and we have a perfect Antony woven in around that large N. If we now flip to the last full page of text of that play, at the top of the right-hand column, the first word is Antony. Reading down from here is another Antony acrostic. It includes duplications, but is otherwise in correct letter order. The prominent position in the text, the Antony in the normal text, and the lawful acrostic in the margin reinforce the conclusion. It's an intentional textual intervention of the authors. Shakespeare evidently wished to leave on record a valid anagrammatismos using the name Anthony in his works. One final example completes and crowns the sequence. It occurs in a book called Panthea, the collected poetry of Joshua Sylvester, published in 1630 after his death in 1618. At the very end of the book, after the Sylvester works, appears the only poem which was ever published openly under the name of Francis Bacon, called Humane Life Characterised. The following poem, this one here, is addressed to an unnamed person. It begins by talking about certain renowned men of old who were considered pillars of the church for their learning and piety. In old time, it begins, they were held the church's pillars that did excel in learning and in piety. It continues and asks, are all such great men gone? No, the poem answers, such men, such pillars may still be found today. Clearly, the poem has some particular individual in mind, but they're not explicitly identified. Now, amongst the Anthony Bacon papers at Lambeth Palace is a folio addressed to Signor Antoine Bacon by a French poet, La Gesse. In it, he's described as the flower of Englishmen and the honour of the 9 muses. And it also states the following. To him, devout piety, the pillar of the church, offers her most precious gifts that he may rank with immortal heroes. This quotation corresponds exactly, not only to the idea, but also to the very language of the poem. Indeed, it's such a direct match, it suggests the possibility that the poem may even have been written and inspired by someone who'd come across those comments on the manuscript. Well, whether this is true or not, it certainly seems at the very least a plausible suggestion that maybe the poet is referring to Anthony Bacon. Has the anonymous author left any means by which we might test for the idea? A lawful acrostic on the initial letters of each line of the poem settles the question. Beginning with the A-N at the start of the third line, we read up A-N-T-H-O-N-I, Anthony. And then lines 4 to 7 give us B-A-C-O-N, which with slight rearrangement gives Anthony Bacon. This not only confirms that he's the subject of the poem, but it validates the methodology. Here then is a pristine example of the name of Anthony Bacon ingeniously woven into relevant text in order to honour him in a covert manner. Looking at the enigmatic 1611 cover page to Love's Martyr with a fresh eye reveals yet another blazingly clear Anthony acrostic without departing from the guidelines Bellamy lays down. The title, The Annals of Great Britain, yields the initial letters A-N, T-H-O, and the final I-N-E, Britain spelt this way, Antoine, the French version of Antony, which is both perfectly legible and perfectly lawful. The curious misprint now acts to draw attention, perhaps, to the AN string. And yet, there is more. Equally abiding by the rules, we can also read off from the title, Essex, E-S-E-X, and F-B-A-C-O, F. Bacon. So all three of the target names are ingeniously woven, according to the rules, into the first 8.5 words of the fully revised title of 1611. Now we've come full circle. I propose the suggestion of Anthony Bacon and the Earl of Essex as the phoenix and the turtle offers a satisfying solution to the identity of the two dead birds in Shakespeare's poem. The motivation for the poets in collaborating on the Hereafter section was to honour their fellow poet with a virtuoso display of concealed anagrammatismos. But what about the Latin epigram from Horace on that Hereafter title page? It reads in translation, "A man worthy of praise, the muse forbids to die." Applied to the man worthy of praise we've now identified as Anthony Bacon, what does this choice of epigram suggest? Could there be a final twist to the story? Did Anthony really die in 1601? There's a letter from Francis in 1609 which makes a very curious statement. Someone with the initials AB, who was close to Bacon and his best friend during those years, Toby Matthews, and who seemed to be living on the continent, had evidently recently died. Despite best attempts to identify this AB, he remains unknown. Could it have been Anthony Bacon? Could the phoenix have risen from the ashes of his alleged death in 1601 and lived on, perhaps in France, until 1609? This tantalising question must remain hanging. Finally, the Love's Martyr book provided the outer cover, the overt strategy of the book. On the surface, it was dedicated to Salisbury and appeared to be a poetic fantasy about Elizabeth and Essex. Love's Martyr is Essex. Rosalind is Elizabeth. Rosalind's complaint is Elizabeth's complaint. But concealed beneath these textual veils was something else. The secret dedication of that final section from the Vartum chorus, the chorus of inspired poets, was to their honourable friend who was Anthony Bacon. London's best writers had come together to honour their own. And this, finally, is what the Phoenix and Turtle is all about. The birds are the poets. The gathering of the birds to the funeral rite to sing the threenos is the call of the poets to honour in verse the passing of two poets, Anthony and Essex. And that is why, as Ralph Waldo Emerson also said, it proved the rule that there's a poetry for bards proper as well as a poetry for the world of readers. It is indeed a poem written by poets, for poets, to honour poets. And at the heart of it all was the poem which Francis Bacon wrote to his two dear departed brothers in the depths of his grief in 1601. Let the epigram from Martial on the cover in Latin have the final word. A famous book is not able to change its author. Or to put it another way, there is no interpretation that we can make today that can alter the true identity of the original author of this work. Time will reveal the truth and give the author his due in due time. Whether that time has come or remains for the future, the emotional power and brilliance of Shakespeare's The Phoenix and Turtle will continue to resonate down through the ages. Thank you very much.